Gaggle, where we challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Samueli. It's now 9:10 p.m. in, what can we say, in a very depressing, dismal fall Budapest. As I always say, I mean, I'm, expecting the grim, uh, sunless days to be arriving very shortly. I'm suffering from the fall allergies. So, all around, we kind of into the fall winter despondency. Having said that, thank you very much, everybody who has joined me. And Ahmadovich says, I bet George grabs a glass, pours cognacs, and ready for this broadcast. Yes, though this isn't cognac. Um, but thank you so much. And there are a few things to talk about. And the other day we were talking about this woman, this governor of the Fed, Lisa Cook, whom Trump fired. I think for cause, because basically she was there's plenty of evidence that. Peter Kovic says, "What is your favorite Soviet Russian movie?" Well, that's a tough one. Um, I can't say I like um, Soviet Russian movies a, a great deal. You really have to be absorbed in the Soviet culture to be able to appreciate the kind of heavy-handed, leaden humor. Um, I saw a Soviet movie the other day. Somehow, I forgot the name of it. It's actually a famous Soviet movie made, I guess, in the 1960s. Something diamonds. I know that the diamonds are in the title. I'm sure somebody can dig it up. And I can't say I enjoyed it very much. It's a classic Soviet movie because to me it just seemed overlong, and the humor seemed very heavy-handed and very obvious. Now, I think to people who grew up in the Soviet culture, I think this is very um, they find this is exactly very, very funny. Um, but if you come from a different culture, then you think this is really very, very obvious in the humor. Um, and even the classics, the Tarkovsky classics like Solaris, I have to say it's kind of boring. The Diamond Arm, as Ahmadovich says, the Diamond Arm, amazing. You see, that's what I mean. I mean, there are people who absolutely love it, and I kind of, I found it difficult to even to chuckle through it. There was another Soviet film also I saw the other day. Title also escapes me, but I think Sahmanovich, you know these titles. It's the one where New Year's Eve, the guy gets drunk, and he's bundled on a plane, goes from Moscow, goes to Leningrad, St. Petersburg, but then he also goes Leningrad, and then he goes into an apartment which is identical to his. So he doesn't even realize because he's absolutely drunk out of his mind. So he's in Leningrad, goes into an apartment identical to his, falls asleep, but of course the apartment belongs to a young woman. She wants to kick him out. They might go through a long rigmarole fighting, and of course eventually they fall in love. But the humor, this humor that goes on for about 4 hours, is that the that all of the apartments and all of the cities in Soviet times are identical. So you go to an apartment in Moscow, and they go to the same apartment in in the street that's exactly the name. It has exactly the same name. The number of the building is exactly the same. The apartment number is exactly the same. The furnishing in the apartment is exactly the same. And so you just go. You think, yeah, I'm home. even though you've gone from Moscow to Leningrad. So somebody, somebody who smiles can see the irony of fate. Yeah, I think that was it. The irony of fate. Exactly right. That was it. No doubt Akhmadovich says, yeah, that was an amazing film. So, but yeah, I mean, I think that my own feeling was when I watched it is that this could have been quite an entertaining movie had it been half of the length. I mean, I just didn't think it deserved 4 hours. I mean, I think, okay, we got the joke. I think a nice, crisp 1.5 hours, I think will do the job nicely. Yeah, I mean, it's a standard, setup for a romantic comedy. Two people absolutely hate each other, and then they fall in love. Okay, yeah, that's a good. I mean, it's a good premise for a romantic comedy. But for 4 hours, that's heavy going. but then you're presenting here all these Ivan the Terrible. Those are the classics. I didn't think you wanted me to name the classics. So yeah, those the Eisenstein's Ivan the Terrible, Battleship Potemkin. I mean, they're classics. Um, and one treats them as classics. I mean, I don't know whether one exactly enjoys them, but like any classics, um, come and see. Come and see. Well, we screened Come and See the other day. I mean, so and that was yeah. I mean, so Peter Kovic, you should join our locals community, and then you could have watched Come and See and enjoyed Cynthia's very very interesting, scintillating commentary on the film, and then you could have taken part in the discussion about Come and See. Um, so anyway, so we have this new firing in Washington, which is um, Dr. Susan Monares. Dr. Susan Monares, yes, she's the head of the CDC, and as with the firing of Dr. Lisa Cook, so this is Dr. Susan Monares, and they're all. Um, Moscow does not believe in tears. Akhmadovich now says that. Now try that. Now Moscow does not believe in tears. I wouldn't have said it's not a great movie. It's. I mean, I'll be honest. It's a woman's movie, as is The Irony of Fate. I mean, I think it's a woman's movie, and that was the interesting thing that these Soviet filmmakers they did these kind of essentially girls' pictures. I mean, these weren't in any way the type of films that boys enjoy. But Moscow does not believe in tears. It was all about a whole bunch of women and their relationships, and balancing career and family and a husband and a boyfriend and whatnot. I mean, if you like that sort of thing, if you like that kind of Peyton Place a la Moscow, then that's the film for you. But Moscow Does Not Believe in Tears won the best foreign film award um, in the Hollywood Oscars. I think of 1980. I think that was, and I think it was because uh, people were kind of surprised that Soviet cinema was quite sophisticated. They didn't really know. I mean, most people had an idea of Soviet cinema, either Eisenstein or these kinds of boy meets girl. No, boy loves girl, girl loves tractor type films, and then hey, this isn't a boy loves girl, girl loves tractor type movie. It was quite sophisticated, but it's a girls' film. So if you like girls' films, then that's a film for you. Um, but anyway, to return to Washington, so we have this head of the CDC who is now suing the Trump administration for firing her, just like Dr. Lisa Cook, the governor of the Fed, is also suing the Trump administration for firing her. So this has now become the norm, where you go to court, you're fired, but apparently, you got these high-priced lawyers, and in both cases, you have this Abby Lowell, one of these DC hatchet men. I remember him from the Iran Contra hearings. I think he was the chief. Well, maybe he wasn't the chief Democrat counsel at Iran Contra. So he's been around um, for many years. And he was, of course, Hunter Biden's lawyer. And so now he's Lisa Cook's lawyer. He's also this Susan Monares' lawyer. But it's also very strange. I don't think she has any chance of winning any more than I don't think Lisa Cook has any chance of winning, because ultimately you get a job, the president appoints you to a position, and the president can fire you from that position. It's a there's no two ways about it. I mean, the president hires and the president fires. Congress really has nothing to do with this. I mean, it's true that um, the Senate has that role of advise and consent, and and the Senate confirms certain presidential appointments. But the Senate can't do much if the president decides to fire you. So this Dr. Susan Monares started getting in touch with all these senators um, on the Hill, protesting her firing. I mean, she was fired by Bobby Kennedy Jr. On the grounds that she doesn't support his vaccine policy. Well, okay, that's she's entitled not to support his vaccine policy, but it is his policy. It's the policy of the Trump administration, and if she doesn't like it, if she doesn't want to enforce that policy, then she gets fired. I mean, that's the way it goes. But it's become this new thing, and I think it is new. I mean, it's only ever since Trump returned to power that you get fired, and then you immediately go to your high-priced DC hatchet man, and you file a lawsuit claiming that you were unjustly fired. But you see, if you're fired for cause, then you're fired for cause. The only basis you have of claiming that you were unjustly fired is if you can show that the firing was driven by some kind of anti by racist animus, by sexist animus, by homophobic animus, and that you're a member of some kind of a protected minority, and therefore this was an unjust firing. It was a violation of your civil rights. But if you are hired to carry out administration policy, then you have to carry out administration policy. And if you don't agree with the administration's policy on vaccines, then you have to go. So she was offered the choice of resigning. She said, "I'm not resigning." And so then Kennedy fired her. And then she claimed that, well, you can't fire me because you're only the Health and Human Services Secretary. I was hired by the president, upon which the president says, yeah, well, I say you're fired as well. So that was that. So I don't think she's got any basis. I think she's going to try and make the claim that she was fired by the Health and Human Services Secretary, who didn't have the right to fire her because she was a presidential appointee. But I don't think that's a very impressive case, because the president then confirmed, yeah, you're fired. And then meantime, we've got this Lisa Cook, who also is claiming that she was unjustly fired. So that's like that's another ridiculous thing. And then in the meantime, we also had this really very horrific shooting the yesterday, and clearly this is a person who was, you know, I mean, I think all shooters are seriously mentally disturbed, but this one was, um, much as in the case of the shooter in Nashville, Tennessee. Audrey was also a transgender. She was woman to man. This one is man to woman. It's clearly this is if you're taking all kinds of medication, hormones, and then you have, even if you take hormones, you have to take other kinds of medication to mitigate the side effects of the hormones, and so all of it completely messes up your body, and then of course when you do that, it messes up your mind. I mean, it's inevitable, and that's really the problem with this transgenderism, is that you have to take hormones, and then you have to take all sorts of other kinds of medication to mitigate the effects of the hormones, because if you start taking it, all sorts of other things start going wrong, and therefore who knows what the net result of this pharmaceutical cocktail is. And it's not at all surprising that um, people who do this plunge into serious depression, and such serious depression, of course, manifests itself in suicidal tendencies, violent suicidal tendency, because that's what suicide is. I mean, it's a violence, an extreme violence against oneself. But though there's also the um, a desire to inflict violence on others. Now, in the case of this person, Robert, who changed his name, legally changed his name to Robin, um, it's clear that from the little bits that one hears from his manifesto, he wasn't very happy about this process that he has gone through. He said that he wished that he hadn't gone through this process. He says, "Well, I'm not a woman, but I'm not a man either." Um, so you really have to, I mean, there has to be a really serious investigation into the doctors who sign off and on this kind of treatment, and knowing the serious consequences for their patients when they start prescribing these medical cocktails that could have all kinds of um, serious effects, including, of course, as a desire for suicide, and even worse, the desire for suicide manifesting itself in, hey, if I'm going to kill myself, I want to take as many people with me as possible, and that's what often happens with these shooters. So now, typically enough, the media are downplaying this, and they're downplaying uh, some of the various kind of violent, politically violent pronouncements he made, against Trump, um, and interestingly also a very violent attitudes towards Israel, against the Jews, um, and so the media always want to focus on the subject that they like, and the subject that they like obviously is gun control. Oh, well, if can we talk about gun control, please? But it's so making it about guns, but of course it's quite ridiculous, because about this law-abiding people owning guns for law-abiding purposes, whether it's protection, whether it's for hunting, whether it's just practicing firearm shooting, at firing ranges. These are all legitimate goals, and There's really, no reason whatever to take those things away from people who are pursuing legal, legitimate pastimes, because some people misuse these guns. I mean, the logic would be the same as, well, we need to take cars away from people because some people use cars in a homicidal way, which they do. I mean, after all, there have been terrorist attacks using cars as weapons. Um, as Robert says here, transgender care is lucrative. Yeah, very lucrative. These are expensive medications that are involved here. Lucrative lifelong hormones, costly surgeries, and follow up make it a steady revenue stream for doctors, clinics, and pharma. Absolutely, absolutely, and that's why I think it's an absolute scandal that this is allowed to continue, and that no one interferes in this, and the doctors just simply have this carte blanche. They say, well, we're just going to do this, and no one has any say in the matter. And given that, the effect is quite serious, and not just to the patient, because it's obvious that if you start messing up the person's very, anyone's delicate balance in one's body, delicate balance of hormones and everything else. If you start messing up with it, it's going to have all kinds of side effects, and there's clearly a record here of extreme suicidal tendencies going over into a desire to inflict as much violence as possible against others. Just a feeling of rage at having been put through this terrible process. And as I say, this person didn't seem very happy, according to his manifesto. I mean, at least for the little I've read about the manifesto, I haven't seen the whole of the manifesto. It didn't seem very happy about being transgender. But you're absolutely right. People are making a lot of money. Big Pharma is making a lot of money on this, and doctors are making a lot of money on this. Marty. Now, this is very interesting, Marty, that you're posting a picture, because I'm going to come to this picture in a moment in the today. This is a photograph of the Weimar Triangle. Now, the Weimar Triangle consists of France, Germany, and Poland. And France, Germany, and Poland visited Moldova yesterday to celebrate Moldova's independence. And so I want to talk about that now. So anyway, that's the. Do I have this? Let's see, make sure I have. Yeah, let's talk about what happened with this thing. So what's happened in Moldova? You remember we had the presidential elections earlier this year, stolen outright. It's stolen in plain sight. Like we had the Romania election also stolen in plain sight, because we know that the legitimate winner, Georgescu, his election victory was stolen from him, and then Georgescu was banned from running, and then we got the EU managed to get its candidate Dan as president. Well, Moldova, you had Maya Sandu, deeply unpopular in Moldova. And obviously, she was heading for defeat, as was the vote for enshrining Moldova's EU aspirations into the constitution. So they had a referendum on that. Should we enshrine in our constitution the aspiration to join the EU? And that referendum was heading for a comfortable defeat. As the results were coming in, the EU vote was far behind. And then, mysteriously, very, very mysteriously, the vote started coming in from the Moldovan diaspora. Now, only in the Moldovan diaspora from in the Western countries, where they had, I don't know how many polling stations. I mean, it's not, Moldova's a small country. There aren't that many Moldovans living in Western Europe, but they seem to have, I don't know how many polling stations throughout France, Germany, and Italy for Moldovans to vote. Contrariwise, when it came to the Moldovans in Russia, they didn't have any polling stations. They had two polling stations altogether in Russia. And even though there's a very substantial Moldovan diaspora in Russia, so there are two polling stations in Moscow. And strangely enough, there was only 5,000 ballots in each of the polling stations in Russia. So altogether, only 10,000 Moldovans who are living in Russia could vote. Well, that's very odd. And that, that was it. So the Moldovan diaspora in the West managed to push that number for the EU just over the 50% line. Total fraud. And of course, the same thing happened in the presidential election, and Maya Sandu somehow managed to eke out a victory. But now we're having another election in Moldova. This is a parliamentary election next month, and as with the referendum and as with the presidential election, there is great hysteria in Europe that Maya Sandu is going to lose. And if Maya Sandu loses, then the entire EU project seems to, be in danger of collapsing. So we have this massive, massive effort, first of all, on the part of the EU to throw everything it has on behalf into that election on behalf of Maya Sandu. And then the second part of it is to, wring their hands and cry hysterically, scream at the top of their lungs that Russia is interfering in the elections in Moldova. Russia is trying to steal the election. So this Weimar Triangle that showed up yesterday in Moldova with this message that the EU, we are right behind you, and we need to ensure that the Russian scum are kept very, very far from Moldova, irrespective of what Moldovans may want. So let's take a look at just a little bit of the coverage. And here is the Radio France International, one of these French public broadcasting. It says Macron pledges France's determined support for Moldova joining EU, and then blah blah. Macron does all this, and it says standing alongside Maya Sandu, the three leaders. The three musketeers praise Moldova's resilience against what they said is a campaign of meddling from Russia. So this is amazing, isn't it? That they're talking about meddling. You've got Macron, Merz, and Tusk of Poland showing up in Moldova. That's not meddling. But Russia is somehow meddling. I haven't seen Putin or Lavrov or anyone else showing up in Moldova. And here's Macron said, Kremlin propaganda tells us that Europeans want to prolong the war and that the European Union oppresses people. These are lies. Unlike Russia, the European Union threatens no one and respects everyone's sovereignty. Now, when you say something like this, you're kind of blurting out what's really going on in your own mind. He says Kremlin propaganda tells us that Europeans want to prolong the war. Hey, it's not Kremlin propaganda. It's an obvious fact. Europeans want to prolong the war. You don't need the Kremlin to tell you that. And that the European Union oppresses people, yeah, the European Union is an anathema to political freedom. That was said by J.D. Vance at the Munich Security Conference. That wasn't the Kremlin, that was J.D. Vance. And it's not the Kremlin who's saying Europeans want to prolong the war. What the hell else are they doing? It's common sense. That's what they want to do when they make all of these demands, such as robust security guarantees involving a NATO presence in Ukraine, along with U.S. air support and air defense systems. They know perfectly well Russia's never going to accept this. So, therefore, one has to assume that the reason they're putting that forward is in order to prolong the war, knowing that Russia will never accept something like that. These are lies. Unlike Russia, European Union threatens no one and respects everyone's sovereignty. Well, they do threaten Hungary, and they don't respect Hungary's sovereignty. They didn't really respect Romania's sovereignty either. So that's unlike Russia. So yeah, you don't respect a country's sovereignty. The EU is repeatedly interfering in the internal affairs of EU member states, uh, notably Hungary, but not only Hungary. European leaders are concerned that Russia has troops stationed in a largely Russian speaking region that broke away from Moldova's control in a brief war in the early 1990s. Sandu's pro-European allies face a stiff challenge in the election on 28th of September. Now, note this point. Well, she faces a stiff challenge. Well, if she's so fantastic and the EU is so wonderful, why is she always facing a difficult election? I mean, they have to do this every few months because every few months she's in danger of losing. I mean, if the EU is such a fantastic prospect, why are the Moldovans so underwhelmed by it? And so here's Deutsche Welle. Stay West. The headline: EU leaders urge Moldova to steer clear of Russia. Stay the hell away from Russia. Germany's chancellor says Russia wants to lure Moldova back into its sphere of influence. And then say, but the leaders' visit also testament just how fragile Moldova's pro-Europe pivot feels now. Why is it so fragile? I mean, if she's such a great leader, and if the EU is obviously so much superior to anything Russia can offer, why is Moldova's pro-Europe pivot fragile? Germany's Merz told Moldovans that the fact that the country has chosen a path towards the EU cannot be taken for granted. Things could still take a different turn, he said, pointing to the potentially decisive vote on the horizon. The challenge facing Moldova's pro-Western government is partly due to the regular ups and downs of democracy, like citizens' frustration as the country deals with the economic fallout of the war next door. Now, it's very important to keep in mind that Moldova's economy is actually in the toilet. Inflation is very high, unemployment is high, the budget deficit keeps rising. Debt to GDP ratio continues to rise. So the economy is actually doing very poorly. So all of this integration with the EU isn't actually yielding any great results for Moldova. And here we have, but there are less predictable powers at play in the bid to sway Moldovan voters, like the fugitive pro-Russian tycoon Ilan Shor, who is offering up to $3,000 a month to people who attend anti-government protests, according to the news agency Reuters. Well, where does Reuters get this from? I mean, they're always talking about these huge sums of money to attend an anti-government protest. Of course, because nobody would dream of attending an anti-government protest unless they received $3,000 a month for it. Now, I don't believe it for one moment, and they've never really presented any evidence of these, $3,000. I mean, Moldova is a very poor country. Can you imagine how much $3,000 a month is going to buy you? I mean, $3,000 a month, that's pretty good money almost anywhere. But in Moldova, the poorest country in Europe, that's going to take you a long way. But I have to present these numbers in order to explain, well, why are people showing up in anti-government protests? Because she's so fantastic. Shore, who fled Moldova while appealing a conviction on bank fraud charges back in 2019, publicized the cash payment offer in an online video. President Maya Sandu listed off a series of other threats to Moldovan democracy: election interference, illegal financing, disinformation campaigns, cyber attacks, sabotage at overseas polling stations, and efforts to sow hate between communities. So that's quite a package that the Russians are presumably engaging in. Moscow denies involvement in election meddling, but the EU leaders gathered in Chisinau don't buy it. Oh, and I was thinking they would buy it. Russia has been relentlessly trying to undermine freedom, prosperity, and peace in Moldova, said Merz, wants to draw Moldova into Moscow's sphere of influence. Now, Moldova really, it doesn't count for very much. I mean, the only interest Moldova has for the Europeans is that they might lose Moldova. That's the only reason. The only reason they go into all this trouble is not because Moldova in itself has any value. As I say, it's a very poor country. It doesn't really have anything. And it was basically it was part of Romania, and then Stalin took Bessarabia and northern Bukovina in 1940 as part of the Soviet-German non-aggression pact, and then after 1945, it remained a part of the Soviet Union. But the Moldovans really aren't that enthused about the EU. And that's really the EU's problem. That's why they're so preoccupied with it. It's a small country, population about 2.5 million. Many who are living outside of the country in the Moldovan diaspora, but they're concerned that left to their devices, Moldovans will vote against the EU. I mean, you have this province of Gagauzia. Well, the leader of Gagauzia, the president of Gagauzia, well, she's basically in prison. She was convicted in a democracy, freedom-loving Moldovan court. She was convicted, and now she's in prison. That's the president of Gagauzia. In Gagauzia, there's no support whatsoever. There's zero people in Gagauzia who want to vote for Maya Sandu. So that's a bit of a problem. I mean, if she's so popular, how come that there's zero voters in Gagauzia who want to vote for Maya Sandu? So Victoria Olari, who monitors disinformation and online trends, that's a nice gig to have. I monitor disinformation. That's my job. I go around monitoring disinformation. Not, of course, disinformation that is emanating from our side. Not, of course, disinformation coming from the EU, but disinformation coming from those that we don't like. And so disinformation from Russia, disinformation from Iran, China, whatever. So that's what disinformation means. Atlantic Council's Digital Forensic Research Labs. Oh, we've come across that entity many times before, and they're in the business of spotting Russian disinformation. They were Russia gators, they're always telling us about how Russia is interfering in this or that election, this or that referendum, and whatever. Anyway, she told Deutsche Welle in a phone conversation she expects meddling attempts to step up over the next few weeks. So, again, just like when disinformation is only coming from them, there's no disinformation coming from us. Meddling is also coming from them. There's no meddling from us. So the fact that these three heads of state and heads of government show up in Moldova just ahead of the election, that's not meddling. But whatever Russia is trying to do, that's meddling. Olari, who lives in Chisinau, described the atmosphere there as charged. But she said there's also a feeling of cautious optimism mixed with tension. Well, yeah, cautious optimism, because they know that the EU will steal it in plain sight. They've always done it before, yeah, so they will steal it. There's a palpable sense of determination among Moldovans to safeguard their sovereignty. And she said, adding that the visit by top EU leaders underscores the European support that many here see as a lifeline. Other than, of course, those who don't like the European support and don't see it as a lifeline. Anyway, but then he says, Moldova's path towards joining the EU has for now hit a Hungary-sized roadblock. Moldova and Ukraine both applied to join the EU back in 2022, and so on. But now the connection with Kiev is proving problematic for Moldova, because EU member Hungary, a long-standing critic of Ukraine, and regularly rails against EU support for the country, with Budapest vetoing any progress on Ukraine's accession to the EU. Moldova is stuck too, and officials are unable to commit to a concrete timeline for next steps. The door to the European Union is open, Merz said on Wednesday. We will do whatever we can to advance membership talks in the autumn. So they're going to shove Moldova in. This isn't something that anybody in the EU wants. The only reason they're doing this is to stick a thumb in Russia's eye. That's the only reason. I have no interest at all in Moldova. Moldova offers absolutely nothing to the EU. Nobody in the EU wants them, but except for these EU leaders like Macron, Merz, and Tusk. And said the EU is loath to succumb to Hungary's blackmail and decouple the countries. Amid Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, this risks fostering a sense of abandonment at a time when Ukraine already feels deserted by Washington. So that's Amanda Paul, senior researcher with European Policy Center. So what they're trying to get at here, it's a little confusing, is they think that they can probably get Moldova in to the EU because Hungary hasn't really said anything about Moldova. Hungary doesn't have a problem with Moldova. Hungary does have a problem with Ukraine. So they're thinking, well, there's nothing much we can do while Hungary is putting up obstacles to Ukraine's EU application, but we can get Moldova through. So basically, they're going to separate out Moldova and Ukraine's application for EU membership, because they can get Moldova in, but they can't get Ukraine in. So that's why this woman, this Amanda Paul, says, well, this is only going to increase Ukraine's sense of abandonment. Paul also had a stark warning about the risks of leaving Moldova to linger too long in the West waiting room. We don't want to linger too long. The EU may have little choice but to move ahead with Moldova rather than risk the country falling under Russian influence, of course. And then here is the picture that Marty was showing. So here are these the three musketeers, and there is Maya Sandu looking pleased as punch as she stands among them. She's looking a little like Kaya Kallas there, always with a kind of feeling, looking very pleased with herself. And so, according to the EU, the Moldovan electoral campaign and elections will take place under the threat of hyper offensives by Russia, as happened in the previous presidential elections, won by a handful of votes by Maya Sandu against a pro-Russian opponent. The French leader and his counterparts therefore sought to send a signal to voters. Kremlin propaganda tells us that Europeans want to prolong, and so on. And then here. The EU is a union of prosperity and peace. The European Union is in no way the Soviet Union. It's very interesting, as I say, that Macron is talking like this. It's like he's sort of blurting out what may be on his mind. The European Union is in no way the Soviet Union. Well, maybe it is. I mean, there's not a great deal of freedom or autonomy or sovereignty for EU member states. So perhaps it is kind of like the Soviet Union. And then the Moldovan president denounced the Russian hybrid operation involving vote buying, cyber, blah, blah, blah. And Merz, of course, echoed her words. In the run-up to the upcoming parliamentary elections in this country, not a day goes by without a massive hybrid attacks from Russia. Moldova's democracy is in the crosshairs, both online and offline. A free, open, liberal society is in the crosshairs. Now, it's always interesting. They never give us any examples of what are these hybrid attacks. And then they say a free, open, liberal society. So why is the one of Maya Sandu's political opponents, who is the president of this autonomous province of Gaggle, why is she in prison? If it's a free, open, liberal society. And indeed, this guy, Ilan Shaw, he's in exile because he's been convicted in a court in Moldova. It's amazing how a free, open, liberal society is always convicting its political opponents. And then it goes on. And Emmanuel Macron offered Moldova strong support towards membership of the EU, historic opportunity, and then says the pro-EU Moldovan leadership has repeatedly called for the decoupling of Moldova and Ukraine's EU accession processes. Of course they are, fearing that Kiev's European prospects will take much longer, given Ukraine's size and the war with Russia, and, of course, Hungary's opposition. However, the EU is reluctant to grant Chisinau's fast-track accession process for fear of sending a negative signal to Ukraine. And then here is the BNE Intellinews, also, pledge support and so on. And here we have the merciless war that Russia wages against Ukraine shows us daily that Europe means freedom and peace, whilst Putin's Russia means war and death. Our independence and future are in our hands, and we have the right to lose them. So this is a Europe that is continually sending weapons into Ukraine. That's in the name of freedom and peace, prolonging a war that has only one inevitable outcome. So they're prolonging it, and yet Europe stands for freedom and peace. In a lengthy Independence Day address, Sandu cast Moldova's trajectory as part of Europe's post-war peace project. And then she says, almost 75 years ago, after the most destructive war in history, the visionary leaders of France and Germany had the courage to build together a united Europe where former rivals became partners. Well, that's interesting. If that's the model, then why not invite Russia? Why, is it? I mean, um, if that's the issue, that if former rivals become partners, then why are you organizing the EU as an entity that is in deadly hostility, deadly rivalry with Russia? You're defining the EU as a deadly rival to Russia. I mean, if you're going to talk about how France and Germany became partners, then why this the necessity of conflict with Russia? And as a somewhat later, Poland, after the decades of dictatorship, showed that freedom and democracy can be reborn and strengthen Europe. Today, Moldova is following in the footsteps of history. And then Sandu said her government had consolidated institutions, bolstered energy security, and gained access to the EU single market, where our producers find stability, clear rules, and real opportunities, not embargoes and blackmail. And that's why the Moldovan economy is in the toilet. It pays far more for energy than it needed to, because basically it refused to sign on to long-term energy contracts with Russia. So now it's buys energy on the spot market, which of course makes it very, very expensive. But she warned of interference in our elections, illegal funding from abroad, blah, 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 blah. So familiar litany. And then there's Macron again, said Moldova's orientation was clear. Moldova is a part of the European family through the values it defends. The values, as in Ukraine, of putting your opposition in prison. Together, we want to send a message of friendship, solidarity, and trust in our common future. And then Macron posted, today in Chisinau, we celebrate Moldova's Independence Day, marking the country's entry into the era of sovereignty and regained freedom. A common horizon unites us. And in Europe, anyway, so that is the heavy-handed attempt at attempt to interfere in Romania's election. Clearly, they know that Maya Sandu is very unpopular. She's heading for defeat. And what they're going to do, what have they always done? What have they always done? They're going to steal it. And I'm sure they will. I'm sure that they will indeed steal this election. They did it in Romania, and then they obviously they did it earlier this year in Moldova in the referendum and in the presidential election, and that's what they're going to do in this parliamentary election. But in order to justify what they're doing, they are projecting and telling us that it's Russia that is interfering in the election. So Ahmadovich says EU equals NATO, and that's very important to keep in mind, that the EU has become NATO through that common security and defense policy, which was enshrined in the Lisbon Treaty. Essentially, security and defense became an integral part of the EU. And security and defense then came to mean NATO. And so EU and NATO has signed, I think, about 3 treaties, essentially establishing this partnership between the two. But supposed to be kept separate, because you used to have countries that were in the EU that were supposedly neutral. And so that you couldn't ram NATO down their throats. So the Republic of Ireland was supposedly neutral, but the EU and NATO are now one and the same. So now Ireland is also effectively a member of NATO. Same goes for Austria. I mean, Austria is bound by a treaty of neutrality, and yet Austria, member of the EU, by dint of that membership, is now effectively a member of NATO. So that's how they're playing this little game. Um, so one other thing I want to point to just before we get on to the comments by the Gagglers, the various questions that they've raised and which I want to discuss, is that Macron, who's going to, when he's not in Moldova, talking about the EU family and we are not the Soviet Union. You say, well, okay. The person who says we are not the Soviet Union is more or less admitting, yeah, we are the Soviet Union. But okay, when he's not doing that, he's getting into little tiffs with Netanyahu. So as you know, Macron announced that in September, at the opening of the UN General Assembly, he will announce French recognition of a Palestinian state. We don't actually know for sure that he's actually going to go ahead and do that. Macron has backed away from all sorts of commitments in the past, but as things stand, he's promising to do that. But we don't also know what he means by a Palestinian state. What territory will this Palestinian state comprise? He's never spelled any of that out, but he says, well, I'm going to recognize it. But that in itself was, of course, enough to arouse the fury of Benjamin Netanyahu, who wrote, because remember, we talked the other day about Jared Kushner's dad, Charles Kushner, who spent time behind bars for corruption, and then he was pardoned by President Trump, and then Trump appointed him as ambassador to Paris. Very nice gig. It's a very nice way to while away the evening years of your life. And then so we talked the other day about this letter that he wrote to Macron, telling him that France is not doing enough to combat anti-Semitism in France. It's just simply not doing enough. Anti-Semitism is rampant, absolutely rampant in France. France has a very bad reputation for anti-Semitism. This was also said by Charles Kushner. And Kushner, is ready to work with Macron to help stamp out anti-Semitism in France. But Netanyahu has also written to Macron, telling him, I'm not happy about all this anti-Semitism in France. There's an awful lot of it. And so let's just take a look at what Netanyahu wrote to Macron, and then what Macron wrote in response. So here is Netanyahu, and here is his letter. Dear President Macron, I am concerned with the alarming rise of anti-Semitism in France and the lack of decisive action by your government to confront it. So this is the two first. So you have Macron being addressed by Charles Kushner, rise of anti-Semitism in France, lack of decisive action taken by your government to confront it, and you have Netanyahu also. So I think Netanyahu was first, and then Kushner, but obviously it was synchronized because it's really within a day or so of each other. During recent years, anti-Semitism has plagued French cities, since your public statements attacking Israel and signaling recognition of a Palestinian state, it has surged. It's surged ever since Macron announced the recognition of a Palestinian state. And then following Hamas's savage attack on the people of Israel and blah, blah, pro-Hamas extremists and left-wing radicals began a campaign of intimidation, vandalism, and violence against Jews across Europe. In France, that campaign has intensified on your watch. In August, a Jewish man wearing a kippah was beaten and robbed of his Star of David in Lévis-Gargan. Days earlier, vandals sprayed the Paris offices of El Al with red paint and graffiti, branding it a genocide airline. In June, a Jewish primary school in Lyon was targeted with arson and defaced with swastikas and pro-Palestinian slogans. Rabbis are being assaulted on the streets of Paris, and they are not isolated incidents, they are a plague. All right. Now, the one thing that we know, and with absolute, we can say with cast iron certainty, is that anytime there is anything is defaced with a swastika, we know that that's a hoax, and that's a self-inflicted painting of a swastika. We've been through this repeatedly, time after time after time, and we know that no one is painting swastikas. These are all self-inflicted, which is why nobody is ever caught painting the swastika. I mean, I don't know how many times we've had this in the United States. Oh, a swastika was drawn on my door, and they never find out who drew that swastika. They have security cameras everywhere, but apparently you can never find the swastika. Now, they say days earlier, vandals sprayed the Paris offices of El Al with red paint and graffiti, branding it a genocide airline. Well, let's say it's true. Let's say it happened. Then you say, okay, not nice, but there it is. It's people do these kinds of things. I don't see anything anti-Semitic about it. It's a genocide airline. I mean, they're saying El Al is the flagship airliner of Israel, and so when you say genocide airline, that's a political statement. Don't see anything anti-Semitic about it. But you see, the swastikas, that's the one that always gets me. I know that that's a fraud. There may well have been pro-Palestinian slogans. Again, that's. If you spray paint something, okay, that's not nice because you're kind of defacing property. But nonetheless, it's not in any way. There's nothing anti-Semitic about it. And then it says rabbis are being assaulted in the streets of Paris. Whatever assaulted means, and they are a plague. Anyway, then he says that. Notice that he lists this. He says, pro-Hamas extremists, left-wing radicals began a campaign of intimidation, vandalism, and violence against Jews across Europe. In France, that campaign has intensified on your watch. That's the best he's got. I mean, these examples that he cited, that doesn't sound a particularly long list of horrific crimes committed against Jews. I mean, and one has to assume that's the best case Netanyahu has, because if he had anything stronger, I'm sure he would have listed it. Anyway, it says, your call for a Palestinian state pours fuel on this anti-Semitic fire. It is not diplomacy, it is appeasement. Oh! It rewards Hamas terror, hardens Hamas's refusal to free the hostages, embolden those who menace French Jews, and encourages the Jew hatred now stalking your streets. Let's remember, Hamas has freed hostages, and he has done so. Now, many hostages have been freed by Hamas. Hamas won't agree to surrender and allow themselves then to be killed off in a kind of turkey shoot by Israel. That's not the same thing as they have refused to free the hostages. I mean, they free the hostages as part of an enduring ceasefire. Anyway, is that the last one? Yeah, so that's it. Yeah, Hamas emboldens them, blah, blah. And then he says, as President Trump has shown, anti-Semitism can and must be confronted. The president is protecting the civil rights of American Jews. So the civil right of American Jews not to have to hear arguments that they don't like. Apparently that's a civil right. I have a civil right not to have to endure views I don't agree with. That's my civil right. I don't agree with the right of the Palestinians to have their own state. Therefore, I'm entitled to be free of having to listen to this. And President Macron, anti-Semitism is a cancer. It spreads when leaders stay silent, and so on. I call upon you to replace weakness with action, appeasement with resolve, and to do so by a clear date, the Jewish New Year, September the 23rd, 2025. Why would the Jewish New Year mean anything to non-Jews? I don't understand. Why does he have to do it by September the 23rd? Because it's the Jewish New Year. I mean, it's not the New Year in France. It's not the New Year in Hungary. It's not really the New Year anywhere other than, the Jews held it as the New Year, but that's supposedly obligatory upon France. And then here's Macron. So that was a short letter, but Macron's letter was just interminable. And so he says here that, all right, so one of the first things I did after I was elected was to officially endorse on 16th of July 2017, in the tragic setting of the Valdiv Stadium, the definition of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which condemns anti-Zionism as a form of anti-Semitism. So this is Macron defending himself. Oh, my first act as president was to embrace the definition of anti-Semitism by this International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, whereby anti-Zionism is deemed to be anti-Semitism. Well, that was my first act. So please don't berate me. It was the first time that the president of the French Republic had gone so far, and I fully stand by that step. Protecting France's Jewish citizens from the rise in anti-Semitism has been an absolute priority of mine from day one. So when you're defending yourself, of course, you're losing. So the more he tries to defend himself, but look at all the things that I did, the more he's digging his own grave. The more this is going to embolden Netanyahu, the more it's going to embolden all of the sort of self-appointed anti-Semitism sniffers out. This is France's responsibility, and all governments services are mobilized to that end. It must not be the subject of manipulation amid politicization of a conflict that is not France's, but that is affecting its national cohesion and the security of its citizens. And then he goes on, given the fact that I promulgated a law put forward by the Senate on fighting anti-Semitism in higher education on the 31st of July, that we held sessions from February to April on the fight against anti-Semitism, that France dedicated 15,000 police officers to protecting the community's meeting places after the 7th of October, and that so many police officers and volunteers were assigned to provide security for Israeli athletes and tourists during the Olympic and Paralympic Games last summer. Look at this is a long sentence. He's got a kind of a Flaubertian or a Proustian way with elaborate sentence construction. These accusations of inaction in the face of a scourge that we are fighting with everything in our power are unacceptable and are an offense to France as a whole. So there he is. He's basically dug his own grave, because all of that is only going to reinforce Netanyahu's observation. Yeah, look at the problem you're having in France. I mean, anti Semitism must be a real problem if you have to do all of this and you failed. You've done all this and you have failed. You have failed to address the anti Semitism problem. So if you devote 15,000 police officers, you need to devote 150,000 police officers, and you need to start putting people in behind bars. So it's like, it's he thinks this is a defense that is just strengthening the case for the prosecution. History has taught us that wherever anti-Semitism has taken root, notice he's still going on and on and on, and he's failed in any way at all to what he should have done, which is to tell Netanyahu to go, and sling his hook. History has taught us that wherever anti-Semitism has taken root, all forms of racism and hatred have prospered alongside it. Again, Netanyahu says, yeah, that's exactly right. Which is why you need to take it a lot more seriously than you're taking it. Yeah, wherever anti-Semitism has taken root, all forms of racism and hatred have prospered alongside. It is because of this that the French Republic has tirelessly countered anti-Semitism since its revolution of 1789. Consequently, no one can deny in good faith that I am and will remain a guarantor of pressing need to fight this abomination everywhere and always. And it would be wrong to explain or even to justify anti-Semitism in France through the decisions that I have made. The forms of anti-Semitism seen in our country have roots far away and have long been stoked by the far right. Oh, it's the far right. We've got the far right. That, so he's getting that in. It's not. No, I mean, it's not anything that Israel has done. He's not going to acknowledge that. It's not that, these manifestations, what you call anti-Semitism, but are in reality protests about what Israel is doing to the Palestinians. No, he accepts it. Yeah, this is anti-Semitism, and it is being stoked by the far right. Which is very strange, because the far right in France and most places in Europe is very pro-Israeli. I mean, if you're going to, bash the far right, then you can bash the far right for Islamophobia. You can't really bash the far right anymore on anti-Semitism, because the far right supports Israel. So he gets that in. And he can't even, he's so mealy-mouthed, he's so pathetic and contemptible that he's not even able to say that what you call anti-Semitism is in reality legitimate protest, which manifest in all democratic societies, the legitimate protest at what Israel is doing, and legitimate protest also at the support that the European countries have provided to Israel. But he can't bring himself to say that. The far right today, they're also being stoked by the far left. So he's now taking a whack at the far left, which is essentializing the Jewish community and supporting the hatred of it. I don't know what he means by essentializing the Jewish community. Maybe somebody can tell me what essentializing the Jewish community means. Any form of anti-Semitism is a betrayal of the Republic and its universalism. So he still hasn't said anything. However, the definition of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance cannot excuse Israel for the policies that it is conducting today in Gaza and the Palestinian territory. So this is already way down. Finally, he gets there. We have serious disagreements. Oh, okay. But in keeping with the friendship that unites France and the Israeli people, the friendship. So bring up the friendship. Why would you be friends with people who perpetrate such such horrific atrocities? I mean, I notice you don't talk about the friendship with the Russian people. You didn't talk about whoever the French president was at the time. There was nothing about the friendship with the Serbian people. I have maintained the closest dialogue with you. Oh, I have to maintain the dialogue with Netanyahu. I got to get into this dialogue with Netanyahu. A dialogue based on our unfailing commitment to the right of Israel to exist and to its security. Our unfailing commitment. So he and Netanyahu now get this collective we, our unfailing commitment to the right of Israel to exist and to its security. What about the right of other people to exist? I mean, the Palestinians. I mean, they don't have a right to exist. I mean, which is why that right is being extinguished. I mean, I'm sorry, but they're kind of being extinguished. I mean, whatever the numbers of Palestinians have been killed, it would be kind of, you know, let's say 5% of the population. So I guess that 5% of the Gaza, they don't really have a right to exist. So, but nonetheless, me, Macron, and my good friend Bibi, we are unfailingly committed to Israel's right to exist. Our determination to ensure that the Palestinian people have a state is rooted in our belief that a lasting peace is essential to the state of Israel's security. Notice how he's begging, Netanyahu's kind of forgiveness. It's essential to the state of Israel's security. To which Netanyahu is going to respond, "Nah, I don't think so. I don't think we need any Palestinians in our neighborhood. Our security depends on there being no Palestinians in our vicinity. Yeah, so our belief, I don't think, that may be your belief, not really our belief." Um, and then he goes on, then we'll play and the shift toward normalization that we support and will be allowed to come to fruition and so on. And this lasting peace will be brought about by a sovereign Palestinian state, recognizing Israel and its right to security, and whatever. Demilitarize and living peacefully alongside you. I mean, it's just hilarious. Demilitarize and living peacefully. Yeah, that's right. And Israel is going to tolerate that. In no case does this dual belief reflect any sort of tolerance of Hamas. Of course not. I hate Hamas as much as you do, more, or any other terrorist group using that state to threaten your country in the future. Look again, begging Bibi's forgiveness. The Palestinian state must constitute the end of Hamas. We are convinced that after nearly 2 years of Israeli operations in Gaza, that this is today the only way to truly eradicate Hamas and ensure Israel's young people are not consumed. The young people are not consumed by permanent war, devastating both. Now, the problem there is, of course, that Israel doesn't agree with you, and Israel is just going to go on doing what Israel does best, which is to carry out slaughter on a mass scale, and particularly slaughter of civilians, and particularly the slaughter of women and children. That's what Israel does. That's Israel's mode, and he's going to go on doing it. And what he may talk about, this Palestinian state. Netanyahu couldn't care less about any of this, and then so on, blah blah. State, Palestinian territories, separate, demilitarized, reformed, living peacefully alongside Israel. A Palestinian state where hatred of others has no place. Oh, but in Israel, of course, a hatred for Palestinians, that's okay. But it's the Palestinians that must cannot harbor any hate. This path is difficult, but it gives Israel a powerful new hand over its future, a broad normalization at the level of the Muslim world. Anyway, that's good. So anyway, he goes on like this, and so on. So you get the sense here that Macron, having been accused of essentially fueling anti-Semitism, that's quite serious charge. Then begs Netanyahu's forgiveness, and then said, "Well, but I'm only really interested in the security of Israel. I'm just doing whatever is best for the security of Israel." Which Netanyahu says, "Yeah, I think I know what's best for Israel better than you do." So that's Macron, truly one of the most pathetic individuals that Europe has produced in a long time. I mean, if one wants to chart the decline of Europe, and Europe has been in decline, obviously, for a long time, but the Macron years have probably contributed more to that decline than I think any other leader. I guess that France has had its share of mediocre presidents in recent years, but they were all one-term wonders, Hollande and Sarkozy. But Macron is a two-term president, and he could still come back, and so that he has contributed to Europe's decline, quite spectacularly. Anyway, let's now go to our community, the on which we rely, and the community on which, above all, the dogs rely. They think, hey, we got to get fed, and we got to be, treated right. We got to be dealt with, respectfully. And so, anyway, let's talk about the comments from the Gagglers. And the first is from Robert, our good friend Robert, who is from New Jersey. Very nice state. I was kind of always enjoyed going to New Jersey, as I've said before. Very, very, very pretty state. And then so Robert says, for those who don't know, Bridgegate in 2013 saw Chris Christie's aides close lanes on the George Washington Bridge to punish New Jersey's Fort Lee's mayor for not endorsing him, trapping commuters, delaying ambulances, stranding kids. Yep, that's exactly that's what happened. Yeah, 2013. But it's also important that in 2013 he was regarded as a front runner for the Republican nomination. It was always a very strange for me because he was such an unpleasant and unlikable person, and that was his selling point. And when you're a governor or a U.S. attorney, as he was, that's fine. You don't want your governor to be a particularly likable person. He's kind of more of an administrative position than anything else. And obviously, a U.S. attorney is also, not supposed to be likable. But of course, he was also very overweight. But nonetheless, he became this a front runner for the 2016 election. And he, of course, was quite treacherous in 2012. I mean, he made sure that Romney would have lost anyway. I mean, he was a hopeless, pathetic, despicable figure. But nonetheless, when the hurricanes hit New Jersey, it was quite a devastating strike. And Robert, I'm sure you remember, it caused a lot of damage, huge amount of damage. And of course, Obama, he's president. He was able to do his presidential bid. of hey, I got to come and see what the devastation in New Jersey. And so he goes to New Jersey, and walks around looking at this terrible devastation from this hurricane. And accompanying him was Christie. And of course, it gave Obama a lot of excellent publicity because not only was the there showing how much he cares about the people of New Jersey and this horrific hurricane, but he was accompanied by a Republican governor. So therefore, hey, look, this is nonpartisan. Hey, I'm a nonpartisan guy. He's a Republican. He's a hard right conservative Republican. I'm a liberal Democrat, but we come together to in the spirit of humanitarianism, to help out the people of New Jersey. And so that there was got a lot of publicity, that the Obama's visit to New Jersey. And I remember I think it was the New York Post had a cover picture of the two of them together from the back, from behind. Obama, of course, is very thin, and as I say, Christie was very fat, and I think the New York Post headline was "Thick and Thin." That they're so close. I mean, they were practically walking hand in hand. Maybe they actually did hold hands, because just commiserating with one another over this terrible plight. But anyway, that it helped sink Romney, and he put. Christie in the front runner slot for 2016. Anyway, until of course Bridgegate. So the question. So yes, Chris Christie's aides did that. They closed the lanes, but there was no question that this was a deliberate act. But Christie himself claimed he knew nothing about it. And I think there was some kind of an inquiry that's a bit hazy about the inquiry, which said, yeah, Christie knew nothing about this, which of course only means that his aides made sure that there was plausible deniability. So if whatever they were plotting, they just made sure that they didn't let Christie know, because otherwise, that would be embarrassing for the boss. Anyway, he was trying to punish New Jersey's Fort Lee's mayor for not endorsing him. And then the big picture: U.S. political power is indifferent to the people it supposedly serves. Absolutely. Infrastructure, services, even lives are pawns in elite feuds. Yes, absolutely. Such barbarism isn't the exception, as the rule. And DJT is absolutely right to say Christie got away with murder. Yeah, no, that all of that is correct. What I'm not sure about, and this is maybe you can help me, Robert. Did Bridgegate? Was it Bridgegate that sank Christie's prospects? Because I remember MSNBC was running a daily thing on Bridgegate. I mean, this was Rachel Maddow. She was on every day. I mean, this was every single day. She had stuff on Christie, that because they saw Christie as the main threat in for 2016, and so that's why they were determined to sink his candidacy. I'm not sure just how much. I can't remember how much damage it did him. I think it did cause him quite a lot of damage. Sort of by 2015, when the race really got going, Christie really wasn't any longer a front runner. But yeah, you're absolutely right. No one gives a damn at all about ordinary people. And you'd have to say, I was always very happy that Christie did get in to the 2016 race. But by then, he really was just old news. I mean, no one really thought that he had much of a chance. He's a very nasty piece of work. I mean, that story, the Bridgegate closing the lanes, just shows the nastiness, meanness, and pettiness that Christie is capable of. And that's really what Christie's been about all of these years. Very petulant about Trump. I mean, he's just really, he's not forgiven Trump really for, I think, taking the nomination away from him and for not giving him a job in his administration. I guess he didn't give him a job because of Kushner. It was Chris Christie, as U.S. Attorney for New Jersey, who sent away Jared Kushner's dad, Charles, who we were talking about a moment ago, and I think that Jared, I think, put a block on any job for Christie. Anyway, thank you so much, Robert, as always. Thank you, appreciate that. And then Robert asked, don't you think that Stalin's decision to deport Poles, Volga Germans, Koreans, and whole Caucasus nations created a ticking time bomb for today's Russia, one still detonating in the form of separatism, Russophobia, bitterness, and fractured identities? Well, that's probably true. But, all right, I would say, you cut him a little bit of slack in that this happened in wartime, and that he was basically punishing people for collaboration. Now, it's obviously in no sense in accordance with the principles of justice that you collectively punish a people. I mean, that you simply pick up everybody, lock, stock, and barrel, and then move them out and dump them somewhere. However, I don't know whether that was necessarily a ticking time bomb, because Khrushchev reversed that policy, so that policy was reversed, and that didn't really do anything to ameliorate these ethnic problems. My own feeling, to be honest, is that the Bolsheviks kind of created their own problem for themselves, and they did it at a very early stage by promoting every single nationalism that there could be, except for Russian nationalism. So when they pursued that policy of Korenizatsiya, which means anybody at all, not just Ukrainians, but however obscure a kind of your nationality. They started promoting, oh yeah, these are a separate people. They must have their own separate language, they have their own separate institution, and so they did this. This went on for a number of years, and then they built up this patchwork, this quilt of all of these, governments, self-governments, and institutions that were sort of autonomous, and then they weren't autonomous. Some were republics, some were oblasts. They had this really was kind of a patchwork creation of the USSR, and so when the Communist Party began to crumble, then your ability to hold on to this entity just began to disintegrate. Now, if they actually pursued a policy, I think, of Russianization early on, I think they could have removed some of these problems. But Lenin decided he wanted to create this union of Soviet Socialist republics. He wanted to create these republics, which really were theoretically independent. All the way up to the right of secession. I mean, that was from early on, it was accepted that the republics would have the right to secede. Now, in practical terms, of course, they couldn't secede because everything was run by the Communist Party, and the Communist Party wouldn't allow it. But I think Stalin's idea, which didn't prevail, which was that these would be republics within the Russian Federation. So they would be kind of also Soviet Socialist republics, but they would be a part of the Russian Federation. Now, I don't know whether that would necessarily have alleviated the problems. Um, but I think it, if you didn't give them the right to secede, then you could, you'll be able to address these nationality problems with greater success. But what the Soviet system did was by promoting all these nationalities. Now, Stalin did in his later years, starting from the 1930s and through pretty much to his death. He did pursue a Russianization policy, and he promoted the Russian Orthodox Church. So he moved in a very conservative direction from, I guess, from about 1939 onwards, but maybe even earlier, um, because I think he saw that he was actually creating a system that will eventually disintegrate. So he wanted to then essentially, that's why he pursued Russianization. But the Russianization was abandoned after his death. The promotion of the Russian Orthodox Church was abandoned after his death. So Khrushchev kind of, and then his successors, then essentially let this whole this gradual shift from the center take place. So I think what then particularly through the Brezhnev years, that these republics became more and more satrapies of the leaders who ran them, the Aliyevs who ran Azerbaijan, and so on. So they just moved further and further away from the control of Moscow, and then all it needed was some I don't know, half-witted, but maybe well-meaning but half-witted person, like Gorbachev, who's going to modernize the system for everything to break up. So I don't. I guess I don't think that was that the treatment, Stalin's treatment, was really that decisive, because these policies were reversed after his death, and many of these punished peoples were allowed to return to their homeland. And in Ukraine, the Banderites were allowed to return to Ukraine. The collaborators were forgiven. I mean, he basically, Khrushchev, they opened the gulags, they released the collaborators, and they, I mean, unless you were a war criminal, then you would still expect to be punished. But collaboration in itself was no longer a punishable crime under Khrushchev. So that's why I don't think that was decisive. Anyway, thank you, Robert, for that question. Cynthia, always very good to see you, Cynthia. Thank you so much, as always, for your question. And as I always say to Gagglers, remember, we have a movie night. We post a movie. Last Monday, we had The Night Porter. We spent quite a lot of time on Tuesday discussing The Night Porter. I mean, it's a film open to many interpretations. I think my interpretation doesn't agree with other people's interpretation, but that's part of the reason of having a film club, that there's disagreements over interpretation. But what is non-negotiable is that when you watch the movie, you need to read Cynthia's fascinating information, all sorts of background knowledge about how the film was made, the directors, the actors, everything that went into it. Cynthia provides all of that. So watch the movie and read Cynthia's really interesting comment and really fascinating research that she has done. Anyway, Cynthia asks, I know Ukraine is unable to launch any of its long-range missiles, drones, without assistance from the US. But is this assistance done through the DoD or the CIA? If it's done through the CIA, that may explain why Trump, despite being very angry at Zelensky for bombing oil infrastructure that services Hungary, can't actually do anything to stop the bombing. You say that the Federal Reserve shouldn't operate independently of the president. But in my opinion, the same could be said about the CIA as well. Um, well, I tend to think that the targeting is done by the military. I think these are military satellites. I think these are um, DoD people who are providing the satellite intelligence, satellite information to the Ukrainians, and they're the ones who are actually doing the targeting. I don't think the CIA goes in for that kind of thing. I mean, the CIA, it certainly carries out uh, maybe terroristic acts, subversion, espionage, organizing political movements. I don't think it's involved in military targeting. That's not within its remit. So I think the intelligence that the Ukrainians are being provided is coming from the DoD. The CIA is, I mean, obviously it's not independent of the president, but it's an interesting case that it's like the CIA or MI6 or any really I mean, like the KGB in the Soviet Union. I'm not exactly sure, like the FSB and the SVR in Russia. They kind of are a law unto themselves. And that, I think, is always the problem with having these agencies, these intelligence agencies, that they don't actually keep the political leaders fully informed of everything they're doing. And the reason they don't keep them informed is they want to give the leaders plausible deniability. So in a way, they're trying to figure out, well, what does the political leader want, and we will do that, but we're not going to tell him ahead of time exactly what we're going to do, because then he will know, and that if things go wrong, then he will be in an embarrassing position, because then he will be asked, "Did you know ahead of time that this would be done?" And he'll say, "No, I didn't." In which case he would be lying, and then that would be a serious problem. Or if he says, "Yeah, I did," and then in that case, he will be responsible for a complete cock up. And so we have all kinds of things. Like we have these coups, various coups. Now, if you look at the coup against Mossadegh in Iran, I mean, that was obviously arranged by the CIA, but I don't think the CIA really told Eisenhower and Dulles what they were going to do. But since it was a success, Eisenhower and Dulles were well satisfied with what happened. And other CIA coup against Allende in Chile, or the CIA against Arbenz in Guatemala. So it happens. The presidents are well satisfied, and then they give a kind of generic response. Well, we didn't have anything to do with that. That was a kind of a spontaneous uprising on the part of the people. Now, when you get something which is a complete and almighty fiasco, such as the Bay of Pigs invasion, well, then that becomes a problem, because the CIA went ahead with the invasion. They told Kennedy about it in sort of very general terms, what they were doing. I don't think they didn't give Kennedy a detailed briefing about the plan, and then it turned into a fiasco. And of course, then Kennedy carried the can, because he ultimately had to admit, "Yeah, I knew about this. So yeah, I authorized an invasion of Cuba, and it was a fiasco, and I'm responsible for the fiasco." So that was an embarrassment. So it's like, when you have you can't always tell ahead of time, is this going to be a successful operation or an unsuccessful operation? If it's a successful, then you're happy to say, yeah, yeah, the president was kind of fully informed about this. If it's unsuccessful, then you got to say, well, I mean, the president really he didn't know about any of this. So it's all just a matter of the you have to present the president with plausible deniability. It enables him to take credit if it's successful and to distance himself if it turns out to be a failure. But I think in terms of targeting, that's DOD. I think the CIA doesn't get involved in day-to-day military work. Um, and anyway, Cynthia then goes on. Another thing, I know that Trump made a deal with the EU, which entails them buying US-made weapons for Ukraine. But does that deal also include them buying US military and intelligence services to launch these US-made weapons? And what about the huge cost of running Ukraine's government, including its entire social and public infrastructure, from hospitals and schools and roads and bridges? Will the US continue to pay for such things, or will the EU start paying for that as well? Well, the I think the intelligence I think comes from will come from the Americans. I don't think the Americans share intelligence with the Europeans. I don't think they're going to tell the Europeans anything that the Europeans might use for their own ends. So I think that there are um, advisors in Ukraine, American advisors who will be providing them with that intelligence. But it's a very good question because Trump wants to somehow distance himself from these arms shipments, but he can't distance himself from the arms shipment because this is serious business. And if these weapons are going to be used to target, um, military targets inside Russia or whatever targets, oil infrastructure, oil depots, or anything else in Russia, then it would have to be the Americans. And that's why, I mean, you put your finger on a key issue. That's why Trump's claim that, oh, this has nothing to do with us is so disingenuous, because Ukraine cannot use these American weapons without intelligence. And this intelligence will be coming directly from the Americans. It's not going to be going through third parties. The Americans aren't going to give intelligence to Germans, and then because they just don't trust the Germans, so they're going to provide the intelligence directly to Ukraine. Now, so far, Trump has obviously not been happy about targeting intelligence for weapons that are American. He brought that to an end, which Biden was doing, which is intelligence for the ATACMS. But the Ukraine is using drones and uses drones that it produces itself, and it's using them all the time. So the Americans are providing intelligence for that. So even so I guess they feel that, well, that's still intelligence. Those are Ukrainian weapons, and we can provide them with intelligence. But it's a little different if we provide intelligence for American weapons. So I think that's the kind of distinction Trump is making. It's not a very plausible distinction. It may be a distinction that Trump is very pleased with, but the Russians don't think so. If these weapons are coming from United States, they're American weapons. They require American intelligence to use, and just because Europeans are paying for it, and I'm not even sure that that's actually the way it's going to work. The exact financing is always a little murky. Are the Europeans really going to, whip out their checkbooks and be coming out of European accounts, or will they get the money from the United States and then promise to pay back? Or I'm not sure exactly how the financing will work, but it is clearly American targeting. it's American weapons and American targeting, and the Russians aren't going to make any distinction. But so far, the Russians are somehow drawing a distinction between Trump and the Europeans. So they never say anything negative about Trump, never say anything negative about the United States, even though they dump on the Europeans. But we'll see whether that will continue. If Trump does decide to escalate, and escalate means some serious bombing of Russian territory by Ukraine using American weapons and American intelligence, we'll see whether the Russians will continue to speak so highly of Trump. Anyway, thank you so much, Cynthia. That's a really interesting question. Oh, and there's another part of it, which is, what about the huge cost of running Ukraine's government, including entire social and public infrastructure, hospitals and schools, roads and bridges? Well, the U.S., I think, is going to do that. I think that's being discussed right now. I think there is that's a bill working its way through Congress to provide funding for Ukraine's pensions, Ukraine's infrastructure, all of that is absolutely that's legislation being sponsored in Congress right now. I don't know whether Trump is going to sign such legislation, but he may not have a choice, because it may be that there'll be such overwhelming support within both houses of Congress for paying for Ukraine's government and Ukraine's pensions and housing and whatever, that it might be veto proof. So even if Trump wants to veto it, that might veto proof. But Trump might just say, hey, that's humanitarian. You know, I just want to, Ukrainians should be able to live a decent kind of life. Got to pay their pensions. You don't want Ukrainian grannies thrown out onto the street. So Trump may sign. Oh, that's okay. That's quite benign. That's not paying for any weapons. So he might sign this legislation. But that is working its way through Congress now. But the Europeans are shutting out for this. So there's Ukrainians are getting more in by way of pensions than Americans are. Anyway, thank you, Cynthia. And then Robert says transgender. Oh yeah, we had this one. Marty, always good to see you. Thank you as always, Marty. Appreciate that. Very generous. And Robert says, didn't Samantha Power just fess up that USAID spent millions in Moldova to push Maya Sandu across the finish line? I don't know whether she did that. It's quite possible. If she did, I missed it. But there's no question that they did all of that. That's there's no way. Maya Sandu is very unpopular in Moldova. That is why she's imprisoning the opposition. That's why she's always perennially in trouble in every election, and she perennially has to wheel out all the EU worthies to come in and bail her out. Now, I don't know about USAID, but we do know that the EU spent an awful lot of money. They poured in an enormous amount of money to get Maya Sandu over the finish line. So, but it's quite possible that USAID did the same thing. I mean, USAID works with all of these Sorosites. I mean, they work hand in hand, and Moldova is infiltrated through and through with the Sorosites, as is most countries in Eastern Europe. I mean, they're all run by the Sorosites. So anyway, Cynthia says, even though Trump announced that he was firing Federal Reserve Governor Lisa Cook, she has not been removed from her position and is suing the Trump administration to block the firing. So until the court rules on the matter, she's still considered an active governor. But if the court doesn't issue a ruling until after Trump leaves office, could that mean she might not even be fired? I think that the courts will probably move quite quickly on this. I would imagine a district court will rule in her favor I'm sure she'll, if it's in the D.C. Court, or I mean, where is she? I think she's in Illinois, or is she in Michigan? Maybe she's in Michigan. I'm sure they'll find a district court that will rule in her favor. Then the administration will appeal that, and and then I think whichever way that's going to go, even if it, I mean, whichever way the appellate court rules is going to be appealed up to the Supreme Court. So I think that um, if the circuit court upholds the district court, I think they'll rule very quickly, and then it'll be moved quite quickly to the Supreme Court. And I would imagine the ruling will be quite quick. It's not a particularly complicated case, so I would have thought within a few months it will be settled. I mean, most of the other cases involving Trump firing or Trump withholding funds went through the legal system pretty quickly. So I would imagine this will be done quite quickly. However, it is true that if Trump, well, I mean, if after 2028 the Democrats return to the White House, Lisa Cook, if she's gone, Lisa Cook will be reappointed. So if there is some Gavin Newsom becomes president, President Gavin Newsom will probably, as first order of business, reappoint. I mean, if there's a governorship open, he'll reappoint Lisa Cook as governor. But I would think this will be done quite quickly. And then Robert says, Alex Craner mentioned a book, British in the Balkans. According to Craner, the author Carol Hodge argues Britain framed Balkan conflicts as ancient hatreds, claiming to keep the peace while in fact stoking divisions. By engineering cultural and ethnic antagonism, the Brits helped to incite wars. I think that's correct. I think that's exactly what they did. Now, the British before World War One and even between the war years, the British supported the Serbs. They didn't particularly like the others in the Balkans, like the Croats, because they saw them as essentially pro-German, and so therefore they promoted the Serbs. This unfortunately gave the Serbs a false sense of security. They didn't really realize, because the Serbs thought, we used to have the British who were on our side, and then we had the Americans. They fought with us, and then we had, the British were supported Tito. Now Tito, of course, was against Serbian nationalism, but nonetheless, the British supported Tito's partisans, and so the Serbs in 1990, 1991 assumed, the British will go on supporting us. There's this long relationship with us. World War One, World War Two. They're on our side. They didn't realize that somehow once the Cold War was over, the Serbs were seen to be thoroughly detrimental to what the British perceived as their interests. The interests of the British were to push Russia out of the Balkans altogether, and the Serbs were seen as a stand-in for the Russians. So the British began supporting those who hated the Serbs. They supported the Croats, they supported the Slovenes, and then of course they turned around and supported the Muslims in Bosnia, and of course then the Muslim Albanians in Kosovo. So all of this was about picking and choosing which ethnic group will be most favorable to the British interest. Now, I don't think it's a little unfair to just isolate the British in all of this. The Germans did that. The Germans were the ones who blazed the trail in this. I mean, it was the Germans who they did this obviously in Ukraine when they identified Ukrainian nationalism as something that they could make use of. Um, but the Germans also saw this in the Balkans. They saw that, hey, we don't like the Serbs. The Serbs are very pro-Russian. We're going to support the Croats. We're going to support the Slovenes, and this is very important. We're going to support the Muslims. And so it was the Germans who kind of blazed the trail. The British and the Americans only really came afterwards, but essentially made exactly the same decisions: whom to support and whom to hate. Now, the British, of course, also did something really very bad in when they were waging their war in 1940-41. You remember Yugoslavia signed a non-aggression treaty with Germany, which made sense. It's non-aggression, so they basically said Yugoslavia was staying out of the war. Well, the British weren't going to allow Yugoslavia to stay out of the war, so they staged a coup. They overthrew the monarch in Belgrade, the king of Yugoslavia, and put in his place King Paul. And the first thing King Paul did, he was just a kid, was to abrogate the non-aggression treaty with Germany, which is what the British wanted him to do. But of course, the British weren't in any position to do anything for Yugoslavia. So essentially, Hitler just unleashed the full force and fury of the Wehrmacht on Yugoslavia. So the British just staged this coup, knowing that this would lead to the abrogation of the treaty, and Yugoslavia got absolutely hammered by the Wehrmacht. A totally devastating war that Hitler unleashed against Yugoslavia. So you saw the sheer irresponsibility of the British actions. Now, anyway, thank you so much, Robert. And then Summer Petros, thank you so much. Good to see you again. And Summer Petros asks, which economy will sink first, France or UK? Which will sink deeper? Both countries are mooted to be needing an IMF bailout this autumn. Yeah, can the IMF afford to do both? It's a really good question as to who it will be first. I would imagine that France will probably be first. I mean, because France is heading for an almighty political crisis. The government is on the brink of collapse, and I think France is going to need an IMF bailout. But the British are also in a terrible condition, and so you're absolutely right. It might be a case of both of them will be needing an IMF bailout, and in the meantime, you have Friedrich Merz saying that Germany can't afford to run its welfare state. That's been obvious now for a long time. But what's interesting is that both in the case of Britain, France, and in all three cases, they're maintaining this lunacy of supporting Ukraine. We just mentioned how they're supporting Ukraine, keeping Ukraine's pensions funded, keeping roads, bridges, railways, housing. Everything is doubtless unemployment benefits, all being funded by the British, the French, and the Germans, and they've all made this commitment, that they're going to raise their military spending to 5% of GDP. Now, of course, there's a lot of fudging of the numbers there and so on, but nonetheless, they are obviously going to spend more on their militaries, but they don't have the money, and and they're looking for an IMF bailout. Now, IMF bailouts come with a lot of strings, as you know. Those are that's not a free loan. Hey, here's some money, do what you want with it. They come with a lot of strings, and the strings are you got to cut public spending, and you got to really, start reducing the size of government. Well, it's going to be very hard to justify your military spending, justify your funds for Ukraine, while the IMF is demanding that you cut back on welfare, which is what IMF always demands, that you cut back on welfare spending. And because I doubt whether the IMF is going to say, well, you've got to stop giving all this money to Ukraine. No, the IMF will say, well, you've got to cut back on your welfare payments. You've got to stop subsidizing granny's electricity bills. That's what the IMF does. So I think Britain and France, I think you're absolutely right, are heading for an almighty crisis. Anyway, thank you, Summer Petrus. Appreciate that. And Vic Shakapopoulos asks, dear George, what would be your favorite non-English language cinema? That's a very interesting question. What would it be? I mean, it's I have to say I always liked certain kind of French cinema. I like that those the Nouvelle Vague films of the 1960s. Like the films of Eric Romer. I liked some of the films of Truffaut, some of the early Jean-Luc Godard films. And I also did like the even the earlier French cinema, the French cinema of the Jean Gabin era. That's already going back a bit, but the French cinema used to be a very high standard. I also liked the kind of there was a kind of a heyday of Czech cinema. The Czechs were making these really good films just prior to the Prague Spring. So it's like this was part of that whole 1960s culture that Czechoslovakia embraced just prior to the Prague Spring. The Prague Spring brought it to an end. So the Czechs were making some really good films. Milos Forman was kind of making films then, and of course Yuri Menzel, and they make really good films. They're very funny, and were really kind of very original in the way that they, the way they work. That's kind of irony, and so the films were slow, but really kind of charming and witty. And so I liked that film, those films. I can't say I've liked any recent German films, but but on the other hand, from what I've seen of, like, say, German television, like television series from Germany, they look of a very high standard. So the German cinema, no, I didn't like that. But but when I looked at some of those German police dramas, German kind of I guess murder mysteries or whatever, they look pretty good. So I don't know, maybe those and I remember I thought of posting it at some point on Locals, but I've not been able to get the subtitles. So in the early 1970s, the German television made a 6-episode series, Die Rote Kapelle, which is the Red Orchestra, which is, of course, the famous Soviet spy ring run by Leopold Trepper. And I remember watching this back in the UK, but of course, back in the UK, it came with subtitles. And I was very impressed with that. I mean, it was a really, really, really exciting spy thriller. And on YouTube, you can get Die Rote Kapelle, that very television series from 1972. But it doesn't come with subtitles. And then I tried to find subtitles somewhere on the internet, and I couldn't find the subtitles for this TV series. So I thought of posting it on Locals, but since it requires a knowledge of German to watch it, so that was so I can't do it anyway. Just to answer your question, probably I put this French cinema as number one of non-language, non-English language, and again the the French did make a lot of very good movies. One of those was which I put in the poll recently. Um, this very recent poll about movies about somebody living under a fake identity, like Purple Noon with Alain Delon. Very, very good film. Really, really exciting film. So yeah, I'd say non English cinema. I'd probably say list the French. Anyway, thanks for the question, Yokabachi. Thank you so much. Good to see you again. And Yokabachi says, "Hello, George. Thought on the U.S. getting out of Ukraine by walking away. Trump needs a thick skin to keep the war managers at bay. I just think the target on his back will increase dramatically. Unfortunately, I agree with that. And I think the problem for Trump, and I think we've said this before, is that he should have walked away really on his probably first day back in office. Because then he could have just simply bitten the bullet and could have said, look, I said I would end the war. I said I would do it on day one. This is day one, and I'm doing it. And of course, he'd come under attack and threats and so on, but he would enjoy the prerogatives of the man who had won an election very decisively. And so he had that. When you won an election decisively, you can do lots and lots of things. But now things have dragged on. He's underwater in the polls. That may not necessarily be such a problem. But what is a problem is that he has been all over the place when it comes to trying to settle the war in Ukraine. So one minute he's attacking the Russians, next minute he's attacking Zelensky, next minute he's threatening Russia with sanctions, next minute he's saying that he's sick of Zelensky. Zelensky needs to take the deal. The more you're all over the place, the more it doesn't look like you know what you're doing, the more vulnerable you are if you suddenly make this dramatic decision that the solution to ending this war is walking away. And I think that's why he's kind of missed the bus on that one. He should have done it then and not tried to get involved in this peacemaking where he's just gone from one thing to another without any great any real sense of direction. And so even now, we don't know what exactly he's what exactly he's doing. So I think that I think that moment has unfortunately passed. Anyway, thank you so much, Jakovic. I really appreciate your question. Robert says, from CGPT, essentializing means treating a diverse group of people as if they all share one fixed, unchanging essence. That's I mean I understand that. But it's funny putting it like that. I guess it's translated from the French, essentializing, which sounds weird in English. You wouldn't really say it. You wouldn't. I mean, I know exactly. It's exactly what you say. I'm sure that's exactly what Macron meant. But it sounds so un-English that when you say essentializing, think, what the hell does he mean? Yeah, no, a single identity, outlook, or interest. In other words, it's collapsing a plural, varied community into a stereotype. In other words, it's a stereotype. The Jews are this. That's exactly what Macron meant. Okay, all right. Well, but I still don't like using that word. It just doesn't sound English. Thank you, Robert. Anne-Marie, thank you so much, as always, for your generosity. Anne-Marie is a resident kind of musical expert, a very distinguished musician, played with some of the finest orchestras in the world, amazingly, and has worked with some of the leading conductors and composers of our time. just again amazingly, and knows many of them, and so she's imparted her knowledge of these conductors and composers in on our pages. So we're very lucky to have people who were able to say, oh yeah, yeah, I knew Pierre Boulez, and I worked with Boulez. Just amazing. And even so, I said something negative about Boulez, and I think Anne Marie kind of upbraided me that well, that wasn't her experience with Boulez. So that's really really interesting. And above all, when we post these pieces of music on our music club, we often get comments from Anne Marie, and it's always really well worthwhile reading. So please do that. So the most recent comment was on T. Leulenspiegel's Merry Pranks, and was full of really interesting insights, things I hadn't really realized, hadn't thought about, but it's very, very interesting. So thank you as always, Anne Marie, for letting us enjoy some of your musical expertise. And Robert says, I think Bridgegate did him in, yeah, and Trump pummeled Christie with Bridgegate during the 2016 debate. Yeah, I think. Yeah, I think so. But my recollection, it was already a long time ago, my recollection was that by the time he got into that race, he didn't get in right away, Christie. So there was a lot of others who had got in earlier. But by the time Christie got in, he was already a spent force. So he never really um, got anywhere with the polls. So he was always behind. So in terms of who were the leading contenders, I mean, Trump obviously blazed the trail. He was far ahead of everyone in 2016. But if anyone was going to challenge Trump, then it would have been Marco Rubio or the Ben Carson, Ted Cruz. But Christie was never really in the running. So I think you're probably right. I think Bridgegate had damaged him, and he never really recovered from that. So by the time he got in, I think he also got in quite late, and maybe he was not sure that there was really any opening for him. That which is why he hesitated about getting in. But my recollection is that he just got it. It was already a done deal that he wasn't going to be in the running. Yeah, I think Trump pummeled him. Um, um, but Christie, I think, was one of the first to get out of the race and to endorse Trump. Of course, Trump didn't really repay him for that action. But yeah, but and then Christie, of course, is one. Not I mean, he did two acts for Trump. I mean, he got out early on and endorsed him. He also did Marco Rubio in, I think, before. Was it before the New Hampshire, or I think maybe before the South Carolina primary, when he absolutely destroyed Marco Rubio, and Rubio's campaign never recovered from the mauling from Christie. Christie was a nasty piece of work, but that's what he was good at. He was good at um, nastiness, and so um, anyway, Marty posts a horrific picture of Macron. He looks very weird. I have to say, as the years go by, he looks weirder and weirder. Not quite sure why, but he kind of looks weirder now than he looked back in 2017. And then Anne Marie asks, "Do you like Jacques Tati?" I have to say, I really do. I really like him. I mean, my favorite is, of course, Monsieur Hulot's Holiday. I mean, it's an absolute comedic. It's like comedic genius. Remember, there's almost no. He made this sometime in the early 1950s, and there's hardly any speaking in it. It's all visual, and that, of course, is always a work of genius, to be able to be funny just on the basis of visual. It's just visual humor. You don't have to say anything, and it's just you're just watching this the kind of people doing ridiculous things, but it also had kind of charm and warmth to it. So he ridicules pompous people, but he's also very has charm and warmth, particularly about little children enjoying themselves on the beach, and so he's kind of very very sweet about that. Um, so I think that's my favorite. His more kind of intellectual um, films, I like them as well, but they that it requires more patience to enjoy, um, uh, because something like Playtime, which is I think is a very great film, it's like his masterpiece, but it's a very different kind of humor from Monsieur Hulot's Holiday. You just have to really appreciate the very subtle way that he builds up the I mean, he builds up really the satire. I mean, it's essentially a satire on the modern world, and then of course Anne Marie points to Mon Oncle. It was just on the tip of my tongue. I was going to say Mon Oncle, absolutely hilarious. Just also hardly any speaking. I mean, in none of his films is there any real speaking. It's all visual. But Mon Oncle also has the humor, that this, and but also a lot of charm and likability, and and the character that he creates, Hulot, with his pipe and his trilby, and always awkward. He always means to do well, but he's always awkward. He's always, holding. He's trying to hold several things in his hands. He doesn't know which to put down first, and he always does the wrong thing. It's just an amazing thing. Now he only made, I think, 6 films, so he was a really very exacting artist. I mean, he really was a perfectionist. So that's why he only made 6 films. And I think he kind of pretty much bankrupted himself in making Playtime, which is, I think, his masterpiece. He certainly regarded it as his masterpiece, but it wasn't much liked by the audiences. As I say, it's a much more sophisticated humor. It's not it isn't. I mean, both Monsieur Hulot's Holiday and Mon Oncle are more obvious in their humor. This is much more intellectual. The humor spent his own money in making Playtime, and I think I don't know whether he died in poverty, or maybe that's an exaggeration, but he really bankrupted himself in making Playtime, and didn't get any of that money back. Now, of course, it's regarded as one of the great films, one of the that he was a kind of a Anne Marie says a visionary, that he was a kind of a comedic visionary, um, and Playtime is regarded as one of the great works of cinematic comedy. Um, so yeah, he's really one of my favorites. I I'd like to find some way in which we can show Tati. If somebody can think of a way, because um, I mean, he made the 6 films, so that's not a choice of 8, but some way in which we can do. I mean, maybe we can have something like a French comedy. Maybe we can have a poll about best French comedy, and then we can insert Tati. But we can also I mean, the French have made some great comedies over the years, so we can insert some other choices for French comedies, but with a heavy dollop of Jacques Tati. So those 3: Playtime, Mon Oncle, Monsieur Hulot's Holiday. I've seen all of them with the exception of his first film, I think Jour de Fête. I don't think I've seen that, or maybe I saw only bits of it. But I don't know, Anne Marie, whether you saw Jour de Fête. That was his first one. He made that in 1948. But I don't. If I have seen it, I don't remember it at all. But anyway, but we definitely need to highlight one of the great artists of comedy, Jacques Tati. Incidentally, and to our British viewers, they may be surprised, and I was very surprised myself. So, people who remember Enoch Powell was a huge fan of Jacques Tati. I would never have guessed it. Just wouldn't have thought he was his cup of tea. But I remember he wrote an article in the Times of London, a very lengthy article about Jacques Tati, and describing his art and his vision, and who'd have thunk that? I mean, we know about Enoch Powell is a big fan of Nietzsche and German philosophy, Greek Greek tragedy and everything, but there he was. He was also a huge fan of Jacques Tati. So, anyway, I've gone way over, and but thank you so much, everybody who joined me. Thank you so much for all of the really interesting, fascinating questions, challenging questions. Thank you, everybody who contributed to the tip jar. The dogs. They're not like me. I just enjoy talking. The dogs are, they're very down to earth. They're meat and potatoes types. Meat, potatoes. I want both. That's their view. So they don't care about just talking and art and whatever. So I have to deal with them. So I have to justify my existence to them. So I have to, they look at the tip jar. I have to keep them happy. So anyway, thank you everybody who joined me. We're going to do some more podcasts over the weekend, and then on Monday, Peter and I will do our live stream, and then next Tuesday, I'm going to do my solo. Hope to see you all then. Until then, all the best. Good night. Bye bye.